In the summer of 1995, John Daly stood at St. Andrews, looking like a man who did not belong there. Not because he could not play. That was never the problem. He could hit a golf ball with a violence that made other professionals look careful. He could take lines nobody else wanted to take. He could make a golf course feel smaller than it was supposed to be. But St. Andrews was not supposed to belong to a man like John Daly. St. Andrews was old, controlled, sacred. It was the home of golf. And Daly was the opposite of control. He was loud without trying to be loud. He smoked on the course. He wore his emotions on his face. He did not move like the clean, polished champions golf like to put on its posters. He looked like trouble. And somehow, that was exactly why people loved him. To the public, Daly was not just another golfer. He was the man who had crashed through the gates of the sport. The working class hero. The outsider. The one who did not speak like a corporate athlete, did not dress like one, did not live like one, and did not apologize for it. In 1991, he had arrived at the PGA Championship as the ninth alternate. Not the favorite. Not the chosen one. Not even someone the tournament was built around. He was a replacement. Then he won, and golf had to explain how a man nobody planned for had suddenly become a major champion. 4 years later, at St. Andrews, the same question came back. Was John Daly a miracle, or was he a warning? Because people talked about the distance, they talked about the power, they talked about the way the ball left his club like something dangerous. But the people who watched him closely understood something darker. The terrifying part of John Daly was not only how far he could hit it, it was that nobody knew what would happen next. Years later, people inside golf would say the quiet part out loud. Coaches, officials, tournament organizers, commentators, some defended him, some criticized him, some seemed to do both at the same time. They admired the talent, they feared the pattern. And that is where the story begins to change. Because when we look back at John Daly holding the Claret Jug in 1995, it is easy to see beauty. It is easy to see redemption. It is easy to see the underdog beating the old world at its own game. But there was another story moving underneath it. A story people kept explaining away. A story that did not disappear. It waited. Then, years later, it came back. Not as proof. As a pattern. At St. Andrews, Daly was already a major champion. But he was still treated like a question mark. In 1991, his win at Crooked Stick had been so unlikely that it almost felt unreal. Nick Price withdrew. The alternates ahead of Daly could not make it. Daly drove through the night, arrived late, barely knew the course, and then played like the entire sport had miscalculated him. People love that version of the story. They still do, because it is clean, it is American, it is cinematic. The nobody gets the call. The nobody becomes somebody. The outsider exposes the weakness of the system. But that version leaves something out. It leaves out what happens after the miracle. Because after 1991, Daly did not become the stable superstar golf wanted him to become. He became something harder to manage. He won. Then he unraveled. He thrilled people. Then he scared them. He made the game bigger. Then he made the game uncomfortable. According to reports from the early 1990s, Daly's image began to crack not long after his rise. There were questions about drinking. There were withdrawals. There were disciplinary issues. There were personal problems that moved from private life into public record. What is confirmed is that by 1993, Daly had already entered treatment and had already been suspended by the PGA Tour after walking off during a tournament. That was not gossip. That was not a rumor. That was the first public sign that the man who had made golf feel alive could also make it feel unstable. Officials saw it, fans saw it, but fans did something different. They forgave him. Again and again they forgave him. Because Daly made forgiveness easy. He did not hide behind perfect language. He did not pretend to be built in a laboratory. He looked flawed in a way people recognized. He made mistakes in public, but he also suffered in public. That matters. A polished athlete falls from a pedestal. John Daly never seemed to be standing on one. He was already on the ground with everybody else. So when he came to St. Andrews in 1995, the public did not see a dangerous man. They saw a wounded man who could still do something beautiful. They saw the wild thing walking into the oldest cathedral in golf. And for 4 days, The old cathedral could not contain him. The Open Championship at St. Andrews is supposed to test patience. It asks a golfer to think, to accept bad bounces, to respect wind, angles, history, fear. Daly was not supposed to be the perfect fit. He was not the classic Open champion in people's imagination. But that was the strange thing about him. Whenever the system decided he did not fit, he created a moment nobody could erase. He had done it in 1991, when he entered a major as a late alternate and left as champion. He did it again in 1995, when he arrived at St. Andrews with the image of a reckless bomber and left with the Claret Jug. That is the first pattern. Daly did not appear when everything was prepared. He appeared when things were messy, when nobody was ready, when golf looked away. Then suddenly he was there, and everyone had to deal with him. The final round at St. Andrews did not feel like a simple victory march. It felt like a test of whether Daly could outlast himself. That was always the question. Not whether he had enough talent, whether he could survive his own weather. Costantino Rocca forced a playoff with one of the most dramatic putts the old course had ever seen, a long, desperate roll from the Valley of Sin that somehow found the hole. The crowd exploded. For a moment, it seemed like history had chosen Rocca, but in the playoff, Daly did not collapse. He controlled enough. He endured enough. He won. And when John Daly held the Claret Jug, the old story became harder to dismiss. He was not a one-hit wonder. He was not just the guy who got lucky in 1991. He was a two-time major champion. That fact matters. Because without it, the Daly story becomes too easy. People can reduce him to chaos. They can say he wasted everything. They can make him a cautionary tale and move on. But he won two majors. One as the impossible outsider. One at St. Andrews. That is why the story still hurts. Because the talent was real. The fear was real too. Golf legends did not just fear Daly because he could overpower a course. They feared what his power represented. He could turn a tournament into a disorderly place. He could make careful players look timid. He could take a conservative game and inject it with risk. But risk does not stay neatly on the scorecard. With Daly, risk followed him everywhere. The same force that made him attack golf courses also seemed to pull him toward danger outside the ropes. According to Daly's own later accounts, gambling became one of the most destructive parts of his life. He would later say he lost tens of millions of dollars. He would tell stories of huge winnings disappearing in casinos, of money moving through his hands like it did not belong to him. These are his words. His version. But the numbers were large enough and the admissions repeated enough that they became part of the public record of his image. The same public that laughed at the cigarettes and Diet Cokes now had to look at something heavier. This was not just a colorful personality. This was a man drawn to extremes. Extreme distance, extreme risk, extreme generosity, extreme self-destruction. Sometimes all in the same week. A major champion, a father, an adrenaline addict, a people's icon, and sometimes all of them existed inside one man. That is why John Daly was protected by the public in a way few athletes are. When he made mistakes, people did not always turn away. They leaned in. They said he was honest. They said he was real. They said golf needed someone like him. And maybe it did. Golf has always struggled with its own image. Too clean, too wealthy, too distant from ordinary life. Daly broke that image open. He gave the sport sweat, noise, smoke, imperfection. He made people who did not feel invited into golf feel like they had someone on the inside. That kind of loyalty is powerful, but loyalty can become protection. And protection can become silence. Because while the public was celebrating Daly as authentic, other people were watching the consequences. Tournament officials had to deal with walk-offs. Sponsors had to deal with unpredictability. Coaches had to deal with a player they could not fully reach. Family members and people around him had to live close to the chaos, not just watch it on television. There were personal allegations over the years. There were divorces. There were reports involving domestic disputes and legal filings. Some claims were disputed. Some matters were resolved in ways that do not allow outsiders to make simple conclusions. There is no public evidence that turns every accusation around John Daly's private life into a clean verdict. That is important. A documentary cannot pretend otherwise. The allegation was one thing. His side was sometimes another. What is confirmed is different from what is suspected. And what remains is not a verdict, but a timeline. A timeline of instability. A timeline of people defending him. A timeline of people warning that the same problems kept returning. In 1993, the crack was already public. He entered treatment. He was suspended after walking off. Golf could still tell itself this was temporary. A young champion overwhelmed by fame. A rough chapter. A problem to be solved. In 1995, he won the Open. And the sport had a reason to believe the chaos was part of the myth, not the threat. That is what winning does. Winning launders the past. Winning makes people patient. Winning makes danger look like personality. Then came more years, more incidents, more explanations. There were sponsor problems, there were more reports about drinking, there were moments on the course where frustration became spectacle. There were tournaments where the story stopped being about the score and started being about whether Daly would finish. Nobody wanted the myth to die. Not fully, because Daly was good for golf, even when he was bad for himself. By the late 2000s, the warnings became harder to ignore. Butch Harmon, one of the most respected coaches in golf, publicly split from Daly and criticized his priorities. Whether someone agreed with Harmon's tone or not, the message was clear. People close to the game no longer saw this as harmless rebellion. They saw a pattern. Daly was still beloved. But love no longer erased concern. That is the second pattern. Every time the public turned Daly into a lovable outlaw, someone closer to the damage tried to describe something less romantic. The fans saw freedom. The insiders saw risk. Both could be true. That is what makes the story uncomfortable. Because John Daly was not a cartoon villain. He was not a simple scandal machine. He was funny, he was generous, he was human, he gave money away, he connected with fans, he made people feel seen, and he also repeatedly put himself and others around him through public storms. The contradiction is the story. St. Andrews gave him the most elegant image of his career. The old course, the Claret Jug, the outsider crowned inside the temple. But the years after St. Andrews made that image feel different. At first, the 1,995 victory looked like proof that Daly could defeat the chaos. Later, it began to look like something more complicated. Maybe St. Andrews was not the end of the question. Maybe it was the most beautiful version of the question. What happens when the thing that makes a man great is connected to the thing that keeps hurting him? Daly's golf was built on appetite. Appetite for distance. Appetite for danger. Appetite for the impossible shot. He did not seem interested in playing the safe version of anything. That made him thrilling. It also made him fragile. And when new incidents appeared over the years, people kept looking backward. The 1,991 miracle. The 1,993 suspension. The 1,995 redemption. The rehab stories. The gambling admissions. The sponsor breaks. The public blow-ups. The apologies. The comeback attempts. Each event could be explained alone. Stress, fame, addiction, pressure, pollution, bad choices. But when placed beside each other, the events began to create weight. Not proof of one hidden crime. Not a single scandal. A pattern. A man repeatedly saved by talent, then hunted by the same instincts that made the talent so dangerous. And still, the public stayed. That may be the most revealing part. John Daly did not survive in public because people thought he was perfect. He survived because they knew he was not. In a sport that often rewards restraint, Daly represented release. He was the man who hit driver when caution asked for iron. He was the man who wore loud pants in quiet rooms. He was the man who could make a gallery feel like they were watching golf break its own rules. For many fans, that was not a flaw. That was the reason. But documentaries are not built from affection alone. They are built from what affection hides. And the question around Daly was never simply whether people loved him. They did. The question was what that love allowed everyone to ignore. At St. Andrews, the answer was easy. The love felt earned. He had won the right to be believed in. He had walked into the oldest stage in golf and made it his own. He had taken the Wild Thing image and placed it beside names carved into history. For a moment, everything looked resolved. The outsider was legitimate. The chaos had become art. The warning had gone quiet. But warnings do not disappear just because a man wins. They wait for the next round. Years later, when stories of gambling, drinking, suspensions, broken relationships, and public incidents kept returning, the 1995 image became heavier. Not less beautiful. Heavier, because now we know St. Andrews did not save John Daly from the pattern. It only gave the pattern its greatest contradiction. How can the same man look so free and so trapped? How can the same player be both the people's champion and the tournament director's nightmare? How can someone be protected by love, criticized by insiders, forgiven by fans, and still unable to outrun himself? There is no clean answer. There rarely is with John Daly. What is confirmed is that he won 2 majors. What is confirmed is that he changed the way golf looked at power. What is confirmed is that his career also carried repeated public signs of instability, addiction, discipline issues, and personal turmoil. What is not fair is to turn every report into a verdict. What is not honest is to pretend the reports never existed. So what remains is the timeline. The 9th alternate who became champion. The Wild Thing who conquered St. Andrews. The man people defended because he seemed real. The man insiders warned about because reality around him was never simple. The champion who gave golf one of its great outsider stories. The same champion whose old signs kept coming back. Not once, not twice, again and again. At the beginning, St. Andrews made John Daly look like a man who had beaten the story written for him. By the end, it looks more like he had only outrun it for a while. Maybe that is why he was terrifying. Not because he was bad, not because he was unbeatable, but because when John Daly walked onto a golf course, nobody knew whether they were about to witness greatness, collapse, comedy, damage, or all of it in the same afternoon. The old image is still there. John Daly, standing at St. Andrews, holding the Claret Jug, smiling like a man who had forced history to accept him. But behind that image is the warning people kept missing. The talent was real. The love was real. So, what's the pattern? Maybe John Daly never needed to explain why he frightened golf. Maybe golf already knew. It just kept cheering anyway.